that there would be a unionist majority if there were a Scottish Parliament election today or in the coming weeks. And that would be for the first time since 2011.
Luke is here with us to give us our weekly look at the opinion polls on all sorts of subjects, almost every other subject under the sun by the time we get through them all. The issues, the stories we talk about every day here in the studio. Welcome to you, Luke.
Good evening.
I want to start with the story, which is our big story on the programme today, the turmoil, the crisis in Scotland. And I think the first thing that I said when we started reporting and discussing this story was you've got the SNP, who've been on the slide for a while now, and Catherine MacLeod, leading journalist in Scotland, agreed that this looks like a new low. What is the state of play in Scotland when it comes to those parties? Just to set a bit of the backdrop.
Yeah, so if you look at the Scottish parliamentary election polling, it is basically neck and neck who would end up with the most seats between the SNP and Labour
in Holyrood.
If there were an election today. If you look at the averages, it looks like the SNP would be narrowly ahead, but we're talking 1, maybe 2 seats at the moment. But the really interesting thing is that there would be a unionist majority if there were a Scottish Parliament election today or in the coming weeks. And that would be for the first time since 2011. That was when the SNP last had a minority government. And so there would be that swing back to unionist parties. But of course, what that also means is, if you get the SNP on 42 seats, Labour on sort of 40-ish seats, actually it's going to be very hard on the current numbers for anyone to form a new government in Scotland if there are fresh elections.
Yeah, maybe a minority administration or maybe some sort of confidence and supply deal. Anyway, the situation as it is now is in grave doubts. As we say, Scotland, the Scottish National Party, looking in all sorts of difficulties just at the moment. And just to restate something which we inevitably point out when we discuss stories like this, which is when it comes to the general election on the government of the United Kingdom, it's all gravy for the Labour Party.
Well, absolutely. And the interesting thing about Scotland, of course, is that if the Labour Party, and it looks like they could make sort of 20, 25 gains in Scotland, it makes that task of getting an overall majority in Westminster that bit easier. We know Labour's starting point at the last election would require a really significant swing for them to form a majority. You need a Blair-style swing to get a majority of 1. Every seat that they gain north of the border makes that task a lot easier.
Right. So let's look at the UK picture when it comes to the state of our party politics just at the moment. We always want to hear what's the latest on the opinion polls when it comes to the party's standing. Not a huge amount of change going on at the moment.
Not a huge amount of change.
But that tells a story on its own.
Exactly. Nothing is yet moving. Again, when you talk to people in focus groups, there's this sense that, people have switched off for a little bit. So YouGov out today, Conservatives on 20%, only 1 in 5, very low. But interestingly, Reform down a notch, again with YouGov, down to 13%. And that seems to be a pattern across the polls.
Significant notch down?
Well, it's not. It's the fact that it's occurring across the pollsters. And what we've become used to is week in, week out, seeing that Reform vote just trending up. I slightly wonder if looking at recent polls, we might have reached kind of peak Reform, at least for now. But as you say, the Labour Party comfortably ahead across the opinion polls. In that YouGov poll, 45%. So that gives them a 25-point lead over the Conservatives. Delta poll showing 16-point lead, a little bit narrower there, but still significant. Savanta opinion, all in a sort of similar range. So what we're not seeing is any significant shift of voters, and we haven't really since the start of the spring.
But if we're talking Reform, we're still talking, we don't tend to talk about the number of seats Labour might win in a putative general election, but we talk about the impact Reform could have, and that comes down to harm to the Conservative Party. And when we say, they may be not moving very much at the moment, maybe an inch or two down. Again, now Nigel Farage, the possibility of him choosing, don't know what he's going to do. If he chooses to enter the race and get actively involved in the front line of the Reform Party, that could be a dial mover.
Well, absolutely. And as it stands, we think Reform have the potential to cost the Conservatives an extra sort of 50 seats at the moment.
As many as that?
As many as 50, because it's gone up as that Reform vote has gone up. What we know is that for every 100 votes Reform gets, they take 60 of those votes from the Tories, and they take just 5 from Labour. That's how people voted in 2019. So when they're at 14 points in the polls, that gives them that ability to, they won't win seats themselves, or it looks unlikely they will on that polling, but it just makes Labour's job that bit easier.
All right, let's look at some of the issues that have been dominating our discussions and our news in these recent days. The Rwanda bill finally clears Parliament. And what do we now look at when we try and weigh up what the people think about it?
So the thing with Rwanda is that the polling on it's been remarkably consistent despite all of the twists and turns that we've seen. It's always enjoyed, more people say they support it than don't, but it's never reached a majority. So, it's always been in the sort of 40s, sort of 20s or 30s opposing it. The interesting thing there, and this is where the polling now turns to, is what do the public think success would be for the policy? And what is very clear from the polling is that in order for it to be judged successful, there has to be a significant reduction in the number of channel crossings.
Yes.
It's only 1 in 4 think getting a flight in the air is enough to count as success. 47% say it has to be a significant reduction. And, so that's how voters will be judging the policy. I think there are some people thinking just the flight will be enough. It needs to actually stop crossings.
All right. Now, I want to move on to defence, because that was a big story a day or so ago when the Prime Minister made that announcement that it was a commitment to increase defence spending as a proportion of national earnings, of GDP, to 2.5%. All sorts of questions about how that might be achieved in terms of public finances, but that was the pledge over the course of another Parliament, if the Conservatives were in a position to do anything about that. What do the public think?
So the public support the rise in defence spending. We actually asked about Trident specifically, because of course that was Labour's big pledge, and it was sort of 5-1 in favour of Trident. That goes for Tory voters, Labour voters alike. And even when you ask, is it worth that significant cost, it's 50% say it is worth it, only 21% say that it isn't. And
5-1 is a pretty significant margin.
It is a really significant
historically.
Margin.
Has it grown?
There has definitely been, and you feel this in focus groups we've done recently, this sense that we are in a more insecure world and people are more worried. Interestingly, we also asked people, should the next election be about foreign policy? Should it be about domestic policy? Should it be about both? As you can imagine, it was about more people said domestic policy because of the issues. But what was interesting was that 3 in 10 said they wanted it to be an equal mix of foreign and domestic policy. So it's definitely on people's minds. Big question, of course, who do people trust the most on defence? And unusually, we see Labour now in the lead on defence. It's narrower than their leads on some other questions like the NHS or cost of living, but 46-40 people say they trust Keir Starmer rather than Rishi Sunak on that question.
A 6-point lead seems to be not insignificant. I mean, when you consider that, if the Conservative Party historically have had stronghold issues, well, defence is certainly one of them, along with law and order. And we know that law and order, they've stood behind Labour there too. And when it comes to national defence, then that's quite interesting, because we're going to see in a general election where foreign policy, but certainly defence, are going to be much more prominent than we've seen in recent elections.
Absolutely. And, you would think, as you say, crime, immigration and defence should be the 3 areas where the Conservatives have that advantage over the Labour Party. And over the course of this Parliament, they've slipped behind on all 3. On defence, it's really interesting. We asked people, how do you think Keir Starmer compares to his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, on issues of defence? And it was a significant number. People were sort of twice as likely to say they trusted the Labour Party more now under Keir Starmer than under Jeremy Corbyn. So I think partly this is Conservative failure, but I also think in big part it's that push that Keir Starmer has made to distance the party from the questions people had under Corbyn.
Now, I know you've been doing some opinion sampling on the question of the culture wars and how that's going to play or not play in this coming election, because there was a time when we imagined that was going to be such a big theme. Now, What is your what are your findings tell us?
Well, we did two really fascinating experiments to try and test how much people would react to campaigns on the culture wars. On one of them, we gave them a series of different leaflet headings. So that included things like my plan to take on the woke blob, but also my plan to fill local potholes, my plan to get local jobs, my plan to stop drag queens performing in front of kids. And then we asked people, which would you read on? Which would you carry on reading? And the really interesting thing is that those more inflammatory culture war headlines, openers, were much less likely to be read. People were much, basically, more likely to say they put them in the bin.
Is this sort of anecdotal discussion around a table, or did you measure it?
So we actually measured it. We did something which is called a max diff experiment, where people are presented with different options and they can say would read, won't read. And then that's how you get that thing, that economic issues and public service issues and potholes, always potholes, come out much higher than these culture war issues.
Does that mean culture war campaigning is a waste of time?
Well, what it shows basically is that it's putting people off. It's making people more cynical. Because the other thing that we did is we presented two messages, one from Rishi Sunak, one from Keir Starmer, using more culture war language. So
For example?
the one from Rishi Sunak was talking about taking on wokeness. The one from Keir Starmer was calling the Tories classist and racist. So we presented those messages. But we also presented people with messages about the NHS for Labour and the economy for the Conservatives. And the really interesting thing is that with swing voters, they were much more engaged by those bread and butter messages about the economy and the NHS than they were by those more inflammatory ones.